Hey, what's going on? This is Video Fort Don, and I am back with another Cinema 4D tutorial. And today we're going to be building a neon sign animation in Cinema 4D. So that's the preview you saw at the beginning of the video. And when I finished this recording, I realized this is actually one of my longest tutorials that I have ever created. So just to organize things and make it a bit easier to follow, in the description below there is a list with timestamps so you can see what each section is going to be going over. Anyway, like I said, there's a lot to cover in this one, so let's just jump in and see what we need to do. Okay, let me start by showing you the process for preparing your logo or text in order to make it look like a neon sign. This is what I started with, and then a version of the same text but with rounded edges, and you will need to do this if you want to create a realistic looking neon signs, because more often than not neon signs will have rounded corners like this. And then the final version of the spline was the same rounded edges, and now each letter is also open on the left side, and it has this section which bends backward. And this is where, you know, in this final version, this is where the neon tubes bend backwards and attach to these power cables. So I'm gonna use one letter as an example of how you might go from just, you know, the standard traced version of your logo to one which looks more like a neon sign. Okay, so starting with the V here, if I go to point mode, I can select the corners. So if I select one point, press UW to expand the selection to the rest of the corners. I can right click and chamfer, and then if I just click and drag, we start to round off the corners. Now you will see something happen, which is if your letter is made up of different types of angles, so you know these corner angles, for example, are much sharper than the inside sections here, then you will need to apply different radius values for those types of angles. So if I go to chamfer, let's have a radius of 3, and on the inside angles it will need to be 6 to give us roughly the same type of radius as we see on the outside here. So this is just something you'll have to be aware of, but you know, these corners here, these other 4 are a similar type of angle, so we can use the same value again. And this corner here is the sharpest, so I need a much lower radius, let's say 1. Okay, and just another example, these 2 corners, the one up here and the one opposite, are similar, so let's have a radius of 6. And these 2 are also similar, but they are sharper than the first 2, so we will use a lower value here, let's say 3, and that will give us roughly the same type of radius for those 2 types of angles. So you will have to do this for all parts of your logo, and some areas might be a bit more tricky. So there are, for example, if I just chamfer this section, you see as soon as I start to chamfer, it kind of breaks the shape of the letter. So what I would do here is make a copy of the spline, and in the front view I would just set my radius, let's say about here, but it means I need to then adjust these points so that I end up with a similar shape to what I started with. And what I would do here is select these 2 points, right click and hard interpolation to get rid of the handles, and then let's put soft interpolation again to bring them back. But now we have a handle either side, and I can just move these to what I think is the correct spot. And if I press E, I can pick up the handles here and try to refine this shape. Obviously, I'm going a bit fast here, so I might not be able to get it as perfect as possible, but you get the idea. You just want to fine-tune this until it looks a bit closer to what you want. Okay, so those are the kind of changes you might have to do to your text or logo. All right, so once we have rounded off everything like this, the next thing is we want to create that section which bends backward, like you see here. So for this, in my example, I started by placing the logo in the center of the scene, and the way I did this was after I traced all of the letters, I went to Mesh and Axis Center and just execute, and this will put the anchor point of your spline in the center of everything, and just zero out the position and your logo will be in the center. Or you can just kind of eye it up and align it manually. But okay, in this view I went to the point mode again and then got my knife tool, so M followed by K to get the knife tool. In the new versions of Cinema 4D, I always have to switch on single line so that this behaves like the older knife tool. And I made a cut just above the center line like this and press escape to confirm the cut, and then also just below. And this is because I just wanted to have my letters opened up across the center, because if you look at this here, that's how I arranged these power cables. So I just like to do it in a pattern so it looks a bit more organized. But you could actually do this on any part of the letter you want. You could be maybe on the right side or maybe on the lower side here. It's entirely up to you how you want to do this. As long as you know the process, you'll be able to do this anyway. So let's click back onto our spline, and we want to untick close spline, which means it's going to open up the letters here. And it may seem random how these are opened up, but I think it goes back to how you drew these in the first place. So, you know, when I drew the F, for example, I probably started here and then went around in this direction. So that's how it will appear. We want to change that, obviously, so let's select this point and set first point. And it's the wrong one. I need the one above. Let's just do the same. And now you can see it's open here instead of at the top left. And I can do the same on the I. And I got that one first time around. The D. And you get the idea. We're just moving where the open section is going to be. Okay, so once you have done that across all of the letters, you want to get the knife tool again and make some cuts really close to the endpoints of the open section, just like this. And I'm just doing this by eye. It doesn't need to be that precise. And then select the endpoints and then move them back in Z-space. So let's say 10 centimeters. And that's how you get the section bending backwards. And then you would select the corners, right click and chamfer again. And just measuring by eye, a radius of about 4 will work here. And of course, you know, if you want this to be the same radius across the rest of the letters, you might do this process in chunks. So start by making all of your cuts and then kind of come back and move the points back at the same time. So just doing this kind of thing, and then selecting those inside points. And now I move all of them at the same time. So 10 centimeters. And we can now select the corners and chamfer at the same time. So you might speed your workflow that way. So I've already done this before. I don't need to keep going. This is the final version I will be using to build the geometry for the rest of the tutorial. And we're going to need 2 versions of this. In the final version, you can see that the glass tube really is the same throughout the whole animation. This is the glass outer casing. The actual neon light is on the inside. And the inside lights will need to be separate splines, but we can still use the same spline to generate the outer casing. So I will just make a copy of this. Let's call this final all. And then for the separate letters, you just select a point on the V, for example, and then press UW to expand the selection to all the other points. Right click and split, and this will create a new spline based on just your selection. And as you can imagine, you just repeat this process for all the parts you want to split away as part of a single spline. So the result should be something like this. I have the original spline, which is all of them combined, and then all of the letters separated like this here. And it will be a good idea to actually label these the correct letter and put them in the right order as well. So something like this here, and this will just make it easier to know what's going on at each stage when we start doing some other stuff. Okay, I will bring this back down to overlay on top of my separated splines, and we'll drop this into a null, and let's call this splines. And if we get the Sweep NURBS tool and a circle, we'll drop the radius of this to 1.5, and these are just some numbers I was using before, and we can put the Sweep NURBS and the circle and the spline with everything into the sweep. And now we generate some geometry. So this will be the glass outer casing. We can quickly make a transparent material for this and apply it, and just copy the same Sweep NURBS, but let's remove the material. And this circle will have a radius of just 0.5 this time, and we will just have to create copies of this, and each time replace the letter which is on the inside. So we should end up with something like this. And for the inside material, we just need a standard material with luminance turned on, and then this will be applied to all of the letters. Now when we get to do the animation, some of these will have to be separate materials as well, because of course we want to turn this on and off at different times, but you get the idea. But anyway, the next thing here is to make these extra details you see, so the power cables and the hooks. So let's start with the cables, and the cable is made up of 2 sections. There is the part which attaches to the neon light, and then the actual cable itself. So let's start with the smaller section. In the front viewport, I'm gonna get a rectangle, and let's set the width to about 5 and the height to about 12.5. And I will start by moving it to the first letter. and we'll need to rotate this so that it's in the correct orientation. And in fact, let's hold off on that shortly and get an extrude instead. And this extrude, I will hold ALT so that it automatically inherits the position of the rectangle and also becomes a parent when I insert it. All right, so we will have a depth of, let's say, 5. That might be too much. Let's say just 3. And the rectangle I will round off. So we have something like this here, and you can adjust the radius if you wish. And now this is what I will rotate like this, just measuring by eye. And I think that's pretty good there. And I might make just some further adjustments. Let's say the end cap. Let's put a fillet, and that's the other side. So we want to do the flip side. Say 0.5 for the fillet with 4 steps, just to add a bit more curvature to this. This would be placed at about 10 centimeters back. So now the tube will go into that section, and we can quickly create a material for this. Just a dark color with some basic reflection. Maybe not so high though. About 30% additive, and let's put a roughness of maybe just 10 and apply that to that piece of geometry. And we can call this the port, maybe. Okay, and what I would do now is instance this a whole bunch of times, because I will need various copies of this to go across the entire neon sign. So this will be done with the instance object. So with the port selected, get the instance object, and this just creates a copy. Okay. So if I go to the front viewport, I will need to rotate this one the other way and move it to this section and just adjust the positioning somewhat like this, and just continue to do this across all the sections you need this for. And the result should be something like this. And what's great about using the instance is that if I want to make a change to anything, I just go back to the original object. Let's say we wanted to make the height of this rectangle higher, say 20, just as an example. It will automatically update all of the other ones at the same time. Okay, so that's the section where the cables attach onto. Let's make the actual cables. For this, I am gonna start in the front viewport again. And let me get a cylinder, change the orientation to Z+, and give this a radius of just 5. And this is going to be a kind of hook where all the cables will wrap around and sort of hang off. So at the end here, you can just about see this. If I go back to my perspective view, we need a height of just 1. Make a copy and a radius of 1 this time, but a height of 10. And let's move this to about here. And now if we had a wall section, which is just going to be a plane, let's rotate this 90 degrees with a size of 4000 by 4000, just large enough to encompass everything. And I will move this back to the point where these ports are just pressing up against this wall section. So around 12.5 in this case. And I want to make sure that this hook, which I can't see very well, so let's go to Grout Shading with lines. I want to make sure this is attached to the wall as well. And there we go. So this is a very basic hook. You might make something more elaborate and a bit more detailed. And by the way, I will also take these ports and put them in a null, so we keep the scene organized. And this is going to be the hook, and this is the back wall. So let's make the actual cables, and again in the front view, and let's get the pen tool, and just going from the base of each of these ports, I want to start drawing a cable like this, and the idea is to have it hang down and wrap around this hook section here and then continue down here somewhere. So just do this for all the sections where there would be a cable, and try to draw this in a realistic way. And by that I mean how the cables will hang off because of gravity. So trying to mimic how this might actually be if these were real cables. And I will skip most of these and just go to one of the end ones, because this will need to be a much longer spline. And don't worry if you can't get this to look natural and realistic. I'm going to show you another trick shortly which you might find really useful. Okay, and I would say this is pretty good. Now if you can successfully, you know, draw cables which will look realistic in the way that they are flowing and bending, then just do that. Do everything manually. But you can also use simulation to get this to look as good as possible. So if I go back to the main viewport, I'm going to isolate the new spline and the hook, just like this, and you can see these are in front of this thing we made. So if I just start by moving them backwards, so they actually wrap around this section, as you can see here, and it doesn't need to be perfect because you won't really see that small detail down here, but try and get as close as you can. Okay, and now I'm going to go to the spline, press Ctrl A to select all the points, right click and subdivide, and let's say 10, and this will give us a whole lot more points to work with. And to do the simulation, I will go to the spline and hair tags, and we want spline dynamics. Okay, now if I select the first point on each of these, I will go to the hook, and I want to select these points around the hook as well, and just making sure I have all of them. I think I do. And in the spline dynamics, in the properties section, you want to click this fixed switch and just click set. And now if I click away, those points will be purple, and this indicates our anchor points. And now if I hit play, this is actually a simulation, so you will end up with cables which look a bit more realistic. Now you can play with the settings, such as the stiffness and so on. If you increase this, it will just change how that will appear, and the rubber control and so on, it will give you different results. Now my cables look a bit wavy here. This is because of the interpolation on the points. We have these handles causing them to be wavy like this. So if I select everything, right click and hard interpolation, it will get rid of the handles, and now this will look a bit more natural. Now you might need more segments, in which case you just right click and subdivide again, and let's say just by 1 this time, this will double the amount of points we have. But if you do this, it means you will have to go back and reset your fixed points, because now if I hit play, nothing works. So make sure you have enough segments before you do the simulation, or if you want to just reattach them, it's fairly easy anyway. Okay, so you get the idea. This is something you would do to all of your splines, and you can do this all at once or individually if you drew your splines that way. So what you would do is go to the cache tab and calculate this, and now this will be played back, and you can scrub through like this. So this is no longer just a pure simulation. You have baked this into the frame. And what this allows you to do is to go to the end of the animation and delete this simulation tag, and they will maintain that position throughout now. And then I would just take another circle here. Let's have a radius of 0.5, a sweep NURBS, and this would be our cables. And we would make a simple material for these two, a sort of light gray color with a reflection layer. So quite basic as well, maybe not too strong, about 40 I think for the reflection strength. And that's our material for the cable. For this hook over here, I will duplicate this, and let's have something a lot more reflective with a sharper highlight. So let's say lower the width of the specular but increase its height, and the fall off we can just narrow that down. And on the reflection layer I might have a roughness of about 10 to create this metallic kind of look. Maybe make it darker here, so it's this silver or chrome type of material. Okay, and this should work for what we are trying to do. The next piece of geometry is these clamps or holders, which attach the neon tubes to the wall. This was also some fairly simple geometry, and let me call this cable so I know what's going on. And I can't really see the transparent section here, so for now we can just remove that material from here so we can see where this geometry comes up to. So let me get a tube and change the orientation to X plus. I want to have an inner radius of 1.5 and an outer radius of 1.75, and this is going to create this small tube. Again, we can enable lines so we can see better, and the height is going to be maybe 3. And if I move this up here, this is going to be the section which holds onto the tube. Okay, and I'm just positioning this using my eye and making sure that's the correct position. And it might be encroaching on the inside there, so we can just adjust this as possible, and that should be pretty good right there. So with the tube selected, I will get a cylinder. Let me press Shift this time so that the cylinder is a child of this tube automatically. And if I go to modeling mode, I can zero out the position. Let's have a radius of 0.5 and a height of 10, and change the orientation and just move this back. So this is going to be attached to the wall over here. It might need to be a bit longer, so let's say a height of about 12 instead. And next up, I will get a rectangle. So this time I will hold Alt to inherit the position of the cylinder, because I want it in the same place roughly. Let's set the width to 3 and the height to 10. And it comes in like this here. So I actually want to move this further back. Let's take it outside of the cylinder and move it to about here. Maybe not so far, because now if I get an extrude with Alt pressed down again, we generate some geometry. So I will set this movement to just 0.5, just this small flat piece of geometry. And the reason I used an extrude with a rectangle is because I like to round off the edges this way. I could have just used a cube, but I wouldn't be able to do this. And with the extrude as well, you have some nice cap options that you can play with. Let's say about 4 for the steps and 0.25 for the radius. So just this curved piece of metal. And we might just make this narrower. Let's say a width of 2.5. And position this to the point where it just touches the wall. Okay, and I had a screw attaching this to the wall. So for this, if I just take this cylinder and reuse it up here, let's have a higher radius, let's say just 1, but that might actually be too large. But let's just roll with it. And the height will be also 1. Move it back here. I can go to the caps and just put a fillet on this, maybe 0.25. Just move this on the inside. And then I will take a cube, insert it in this same position. So hold Alt, get our cube. Just pull this out though, we just needed it for the positioning. It will have a X size of, let's say 0.5 and about 10 for the Y size, which is too large still. Let's say 1. And Z size can be 1 as well. So just something like this, and I can maybe just do this by hand. Let's make a copy of this and rotate it 90 degrees. And if I get the bool tool onto this cube and put the other cube in here, let's change the bool tool mode to Union B. So instead of cutting into each other, these now are a single shape. And then if I get another bool tool onto this bool tool, so hold Alt and get this from the array icon menu. And this time we will drop in the cylinder and put that above the original bool tool, and this will now make a cut, like a screw head, just like this. Okay, so that's how I made this little shape over here. The whole thing is probably too large, so I might select this and just make it smaller like this. Okay. And again, it's just the small details which will help to sell this whole effect. And I'm just applying the same metallic silver texture to these. And of course, we need a screw on the other side. And just bring that down there. And this is going to be our holder. And just like we did with the ports, I am going to instance this and position it where each letter would be attached to the wall. So if I just get an instance, okay, so when you've done all of that, you might end up with something like this. This is all of the geometry done. And of course I am missing the other cables. So let's see if I can maybe grab those from this scene, just so we can move on to the next stage, which is the camera animation and how to do the light flickering animation as well. So if I bring back these cables here, and again, let's just keep things as organized as possible. Let's put the holders into a null. And here we are, paste the cables from the old project here. And you can see I had a different position for the hook, but that also had its own simulation. It attaches to the same spots because I was using the same scaling for the scene. So anyway, the order in which you turn on the lights is going to depend on your camera animation. In my example, I started with a close-up on the left side, and then a sort of mid-range framing, and then a wide frame revealing the entire logo. So let's try and do something similar here. If I get a camera, let's set the focal length to 50, and if I look through this, I'm gonna start on the left side, and if I hold 3 on the keyboard and then right click, and then this is how I tilt the camera. So I want something like this right here, and it might be better if I apply a texture to this wall so I can see a bit what's going on instead of the default gray. So I would just copy this material here. And this is just a concrete texture. I will make this available for you to download so you can follow along with the tutorial. It's just this concrete texture, but you'll be able to download this if you want to use the same type of material. But if I start with my camera here, the first animation was just the camera moving forward slightly. So let's do that. If I just keyframe the position, hold Control and click all these circles to set the keyframe, and then move forward slightly and set that keyframe as well. Let's select these and set the interpolation to linear, and that's probably too fast, so I might just pull that back a touch, and let's relinearize the keyframes again, and that's a bit better. Okay, so that's the first camera angle, and that was only a second. So the second camera animation was looking at sort of this section of the logo, right? And once you have your camera angle set up, so I don't know what's going on here. It seems, okay, we need a new camera. Let's create this one new. Okay, bit confusing there, but this will also be 50 mil. And what I'm gonna do is look closer to the center of the scene here. Let me get a null and put this camera into this, and this rotates around the center. So that's what I want to do. Just go to the coordinates of the null and animate the rotation slightly, the heading. So starting at 1 second, I'm going to go to about 60 frames, which is 2 seconds. And let's just rotate this slightly. And that's in the same direction I'm going here, so that's roughly similar. And of course, you can be more precise with your own camera animations. I'm just recreating what I had in the example, and make this linear as well. Let's extend our timeline to 8 seconds and get a third camera. This will also be 50 mil, except it's just going to be straight on. So zero out the rotation, and then X and Y position, maybe just go up slightly in Y. But we want to start about here, and we're going to just be moving backwards. So if I go to frame 60, set a keyframe, go to the end, and just slowly zoom out to about here. So nothing too quick. Make these keyframes linear too. You can do this in the timeline as well. It might be easier to actually select all at once and just tick the linear switch. So those are our 3 cameras. We need to switch between them. So this means using the stage object. And here we can keyframe the camera. So at the beginning, we start with camera number 1. And this is camera number 2. And set a keyframe to switch. So at frame 29, let's keyframe camera number 1. But at frame 30, this is where we want to switch. So let's drag in camera number 2 and set a keyframe. And do the same kind of switch at 2 seconds. So keyframe number 2 there and set number 3. So now if I play this back, this is the animation. Okay, so now I can do the flickering lights in the order that I am viewing them with the camera. So starting with the V, I will then do maybe these 4 letters, E, O, F, O, and then at the end, whatever is remaining. If you want to be able to jump out of any camera, you need to disable the stage object so that it allows you to free roam again. Okay, so let me make a material. Let's call this V. This is currently applied to everything, so let's just undo that, remove all of these other materials so we can just see this letter. Okay, so the way I did the flickering animation was very simple. It was just by turning on luminance on and off, and that's it. So, and I'm also going to change my FPS to 24. So press Ctrl D for the project settings, and then the FPS, set this to 24. That's just what I was using before. And then on this luminance material, let's animate it to flicker on. So at about frame 7, I will have this turned off and set a keyframe. And then move forward 1 frame, or 2 frames rather. Let's now turn this on again and set a keyframe, another 2 frames, turn it off, and another 2 frames, and turn it back on. So it's this double flicker like this, and that's it. That very simple animation. So if we re-enable the stage object, this is the first animation we're going to see, and now it switches immediately to the middle section. So we need to copy this over to these other letters. So the way I did this was just creating a separate material for each letter. So the next one I want to turn on is the O. So let's do that and apply that to the O, which is kind of hidden. It might be a good idea to label these 2. So it's this one here. Let's apply that to there. Now you see it turns on at the same time as the V, so we need to offset the keyframes to that point. So if I go to the timeline, let's find O, and I want this to start as soon as we switch the camera. So let's say at about frame 26, we can move that to there. So when the camera switches, this letter will now appear, and we just need to do this for the other 3 letters. So I want to go in this order. Let's say O, F, E, and then this other O, which means this is going to be F and E and another O. And we just apply these materials onto those letters. So O, F, and E, and another O. And in the timeline, I will offset these keyframes to determine the order in which this will happen. So we had O, F. So let's say about here, the other E, and the final O. So something like this. You see? And then whatever is left on the last frame, we would just use one material. So let's call this all, or the rest, or whichever one you want to go with. And we'll apply this to the remaining letters, just like that. And in the timeline, they will all be at the same time. So let's say just after the camera switches, at about 2 seconds and 4 frames, this is when they will turn on. And I'm also going to select these and make sure they start at about 1 second. So playing this back now, we have that. Maybe a bit tricky to see with all the light colors. So let's get some lights. Let's say a target light, and I just use this to insert lights at an angle. I will actually change it to be an area light. And you see I'm unable to jump out of this camera because I need to disable the stage object, and now I can jump out. Okay, and we'll move this closer to our text and also at more of an angle. This is going to be just 20 intensity, and it's going to be a bluish color. So let's say about 210 for the hue and about 20 for the saturation. So not too crazy there. I can make a copy and just put it on the opposite side and from below, and make this one like an orange warmer color. If I do a quick render, let's see what's going on. It's easier to visualize the lights turning on now because the default color of the scene is dark, but there's something going on there which I don't like, which is the neon lights are being reflected onto the cables, and it just kind of looks a bit messy. I would rather just avoid this altogether. So what I did, I think I just need the neon signs to ignore the cables. So if I get this whole null actually all at once, let's go to the exclusion and let's drop the cables into this. And now it just looks a bit cleaner. Another thing I had in the scene was a HDRI, so this sky object. This is a free HDRI I found on Google, so you'll be able to use this too. And this was just in the color channel and nothing else. And turning this on, we now have some reflection of our glass tube and the cables. It just makes them a bit more visible. So if we go to this angle, you can see what's going on. Now the tube actually isn't working here because we haven't turned on the transparency refraction. So this should be set to about 1.5. And if I try again, now you see how this is working. The tubes for some reason are gray before they turn on. They should be more of a white color. I think it's because there is no reflection on these materials. So let's go to the beginning before any of them are turned on, and let's add a reflection legacy layer and just additive, turn off specular, and in the color this should be just totally white. And I think that should now give us a white tube on the inside there before the neon light turns on. And that does look just a bit better now. And actually, I think I might change my light types from area to Omni. I think they render faster. So let's change this to Omni. And I would put a fall off on these as well. So if I go to inverse square clamped with a range of about 400, I think this will just work a bit better. And another light will be set to about 10 for intensity, but it will be ambient illumination, which illuminates everything equally. And let's see what we get. And the white tube just starts to appear a bit better there. Okay, so this is the neon sign turned off, of course. And as we go through our animation, you know, it turns on and we see this kind of thing. Now in this version, when it turns on, you can see some actual illumination coming from this, and you might think this was done with global illumination, which it can be, but anytime I tried to do this, I just ran into some serious problems trying to configure global illumination. So let me show you what I mean. This is an older version of the sequence. It's the same thing. And as soon as the lights turn on, it's taking a while here, you can see on each frame, the global illumination changes, which causes this really terrible flickering, as you can see here. Whereas the final version I have here, you don't have that issue. This is because I actually ended up using real light instead of global illumination to achieve the final effect. So this can be a bit confusing, but if you follow the steps, it's actually a very nice, useful trick. Okay, I will start with an area light, and let's bring this down here. Let's call this V, and we basically need each one for each letter. Right, and in each light, I'm gonna go to the Details tab, and the area shape, instead of the default rectangle, let's have Object or Spline. And here we will load up each spline for each letter. So if I open up the neon folder, let's get V and put that into this section. So that's the first one, and you just need to repeat this for the other letters one by one. And just doing the last one. And this is another reason why you would want to separate each letter into its own thing, because we use it for the illumination. Now, everything is going to look a bit crazy here, but if I go to the final angle, with all of the lights selected, let's go to the Details tab again, which I'm already at, and set this fall off to inverse square physically accurate, and put the radius down to 20. And it looks like all of the lights are concentrated in the center, but when we actually run a render, you will see that each spline is now acting as a light, and it illuminates the area underneath it, and it looks as though as the neon is causing the illumination, but of course this is just a visual trick. Now, if you want to make this look a bit smoother, you would just go to the samples and bump this up. By default, it's only 40, so you might go to something like 80 or so, and that will give you more samples to just clean up the illumination. Now, this will work no problem without any flickering, and that's how you achieve this type of render. But of course, right now as this is going to be on all the time from the beginning. We want this to, each light to be matched up to the turning on and off of the original materials. So for this, we're going to have to do some espresso. We could just manually animate each light to turn on at the same time as the actual neon material. But this would mean changing it every time we might want to change the neon itself. So what you can do instead is use espresso to link the two up so that when you change one, the other one would change automatically. So if I get a null, let's bring this down here and attach an espresso tag onto this, which will open up the espresso editor. And let's call this light switch. Okay, and I can take all of the lights, put them into here, and they are all labeled. Let's arrange them, and also take these materials and bring them into here. And the only letters which had the individual animation are V, O, F, E, O, and the rest were done at the same time. So try and arrange them in a way that makes sense here. So V, O, F, E, O, and the rest of these need to be down here. And now I can link the luminance being turned on these materials to the light being enabled. So if I open the right side, basic properties, we want to fetch the enable luminance control. So let's do that for all of these. And then for the lights, we want to go to basic properties and enabled. And we would just link these together. So you just have to grab each one by one. And then it's as simple as linking this control to the enabling of the light. So match each letter to its corresponding light. And the last one, of course, contains more than one. So we can link that up that way too. So now you will see that at the beginning, even though the light in the scene is represented over here, when you render, it will actually be over the correct place. So if I start with the V, it looks as if it's over there, but when I render, it will be around the correct area. And you can see that this is the only light which is so far been enabled. Even in the object manager, that's what we see going on. And then when the other ones turn on, you can see it's synchronized to the material. And just watch as these turn on one by one. And of course, at the end, when all of them are on, we have this. So that's how you link up the lights turning on to actual real lights using some basic espresso. And if you want to expand the illumination radius, you just go back to the lights, and it's this radius decay. You can have this higher, let's say 100, but that's probably gonna be too much. But I just want to show you the kind of control you have with this. Okay, so at this stage, you're getting closer to the end, where you might now start to think about outputting the animation. I'm going to show you a few ways to speed up your render. So let's say 24 FPS, all frames, and the anti-aliasing I will set to best, 1:1, 4:4 with a threshold of 5%. I might go 2:2 if I want a really fine render, but I think we'll be fine here. And of course, output whatever frame size you want. Let's say 1280 by 720 for now. And I'm gonna go back and change the output to current frame because I also want to show you some things you can do to optimize your rendering speed. Let me not save anything yet and just output to the picture viewer. Let's time how long this takes to do this one frame, and I will change a few things and show you how to improve your render time. And here we go, pretty good looking frame. That took 2 minutes, and I think I could have this using just a few settings. So if I go back to my options, I want to start by bumping up the ray threshold. It doesn't need to be this low. Let's say about 3%. Now, don't go too far with this because it might break your render. So of course you would change the settings and compare the new render with the old one and see if you lose any quality, and then, you know, adjust accordingly to that. I think 3% here is going to work. And then with the depth controls, let's lower these from 15.515 to maybe 515. And this just controls how many times, let's say, reflection depth, how many bounces of the reflection will be calculated. And right now we're dealing with transparency, so there will be a lot of bounces going on in the render. So if we just drop this to 1, it might look a bit worse, but the trade-off might be worth it in terms of rendering speed. But let me try this again and see the difference. And you can already tell this is rendering a lot faster to what we had before. So this is it. This is before and this is after. Now you've seen that we have lost a layer of reflection, so this might be too drastic. Let's just bump this up to 2 again and try again, and this will of course take a bit longer, and we should expect a time which is somewhere in the middle of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And we get about 47 seconds. So, you know, this is clearly a bit better than this. But between these two, there is a difference, but I would say it's worth the more than half reduction in render time to go with something like this. But, you know, it's up to you. You can tweak these options and see what you can come up with. Okay, so moving on with the export for this, I will do an RPF format so I can extract a depth pass in After Effects. If you don't have a good depth plugin in After Effects, though, there's no point doing this. You might as well go for PNG, and if you wanted depth of field, you would have to bake it into the render inside of Cinema 4D, but I use Frischluft depth of field in After Effects, so I can go for RPF 16-bit and just save out to a location. Okay, in After Effects, there's a few things going on here, and I'm just going to give you a quick breakdown. Let's jump into these pre-comps, and I'm just going to turn on layers on and off so you can see what each layer is doing. So this is my render as it looked out of Cinema 4D. Nothing too fancy yet. And then I also extracted a depth pass. So it's the same comp in a separate composition. The same sequence rather in a separate composition, and I extracted the depth channel. Now, if you want to know how to do this, check out my other tutorial where I talk about the best way to do depth of field in Cinema 4D, and it will show you how to do this. But anyway, if I come back to this, I have an adjustment layer which is doing the depth of field effect. So if I turn this on and off, and it's using that depth layer which I extracted, and I'm pointing to it in here, and this is a plugin called Frischluft depth of field, and it has this really cool feature where you can actually pick the point where you want to focus onto. And this is how I did my animation. I was always trying to focus where my camera is going, and that's these keyframes you see here. And where there is a double keyframe, this is just where there was a camera switch. So I set a keyframe here, just pointing to this point, and then we switch, and with a new angle, I pick a different point, and do this a couple of times, including when it switches to this angle here. So if we go into the depth of field pass, I had to extract a separate pass for each of the separate sections. So if we dive into here, when the camera switches, it's a separate split layer with a different value for the extraction of the depth pass, because of course it's going to be different from angle to angle. Anyway, that combined with the focal length distance change is how I was able to create the final result. And there's also another plugin called FL Out of Focus, and this just blurs the layer. So I use this to blur the layer when we make the camera switch to the final frame, and then it slowly sharpens to the final reveal. So that's it for the depth of field effects. On top of this, I pre-comped my render again, and let me isolate this so you can see what's going on. It's the render with a tint to make it totally black and white, and a levels adjustment to isolate just the brightest parts, and then a blur. And then I just add this on top of the layer, and this creates this subtle glow effect. You could just use the standard glow, but I sometimes like to do it this way. And then I had a vignette layer, just a black solid with a highly feathered mask. And then on top of everything, I had a optical flares effect, but I was only using the lens dirt texture, so using the dirty preset here. And this is just this layer you see on top of everything. And I wanted this to flicker on and off. So on the opacity, I used an expression to vary the opacity over time. So just put an expression on this, wiggle, which is going to generate the randomness, let's say 8 times a second. And the range is going to be 100. And that's how you see this dirt texture flickering on top of everything. Okay, and I mean, aside from this, the other effect I did was a subtle RGB split, which I did manually. So let's turn off the color correction there. I did this using the set channels effect, which you take each layer, go to effect channel and set channel, and you can isolate each channel to a single layer. So on this first one we have red, and then green and blue are turned off. On the second layer you turn on green, so red and blue are off this time, and you get the idea. On the last one it's blue, which is on, and then red and green are set to off. And of course, when you add the 3 layers back together just by changing the blending mode to add, and then offset the scale. So this is really subtle, but if I go and say 101 and 102 for the scaling, now you can see the effect is a bit more aggressive and more obvious. Okay, so that's how I did that. And then finally, on top of everything, just some basic color correction. I took out some red, so just lowered the red slightly, and the blue was raised up, so that's how you get this toning here, and then just brought down a bit in the highlights, and then just a normal S-curve for some contrast with a second curves layer. And that's it. That is how I did the final look and style. So a pretty long tutorial, but hopefully one that you guys found very informative and enjoyable. And that's it. That is how you create a neon sign animation in Cinema 4D. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.